"May I clean your house for a glass of milk?" The question trembled from the lips of little Quito, a boy so thin and worn by hunger that he seemed closer to smoke than to flesh. He stood clutching his makeshift broom, the only thing he could offer, as if it were a soldier's flag. He did not raise his hand for a coin or open his palm to beg. He offered work, the only currency he had left. The door he knocked on belonged to Mama Zawadi, the lonely old woman feared by the village, whispered about in markets, and branded witch by sharp tongues. No child laughed near her walls. No neighbor greeted her gate. To all others, her house was a boundary line between ordinary life and suspicion. On that day, when the storm cloud of hunger pressed Quito to her door, what happened after ripped through the web of silence in ways no one would forget. The door creaked open slowly, every hinge groaning as though unused to movement. There she appeared, leaning on her old staff, her face carved with the heavy lines of age and long solitude. Her deep eyes studied the boy. He stood so small, his ribs pressing against his shirt, his lips cracked with thirst. Anyone else might have turned away immediately. In truth, Quito himself had braced for rejection, for the broom in his hand to be refused and his voice silenced again. But he did not lower his gaze. His trembling fingers did not let go of the broom. His body said to her without words, "I did not come to beg. I came to trade the little I still know how to do." Something stirred in the old woman's chest, faint, buried echoes of years she had long locked away. For a few moments, only silence. Then, with a sigh that seemed to empty years of bitterness, Mama Zawadi turned and went inside. From afar, neighbors leaned at corners, whispering, "She's fetching her staff to strike him out," one muttered. "Or a bucket of water to splash him away," another chuckled. They braced for cruelty. After all, that was the only tale they were used to telling about her. But when the door creaked open again, their breath caught. Mama Zawadi returned, not with anger but with a tall glass in her hand. Not half-filled, not barely granted, but brimming to the top with fresh milk, white as daybreak. Even the scent reached Quito before the cup did, stirring his empty stomach into an ache. His eyes widened. He had asked for little, perhaps a sip, enough to quiet the burning in his throat. Yet what stood before him was abundance, a banquet in liquid form. His hands shook as he received it, holding it like treasure. Slowly, almost reverently, he lifted it as though afraid it might vanish if he moved too fast. The first swallow slid cool down his dry throat, erasing hours of pain. The second seemed to build him back into himself. He drank as though each drop was not milk alone, but dignity, poured back into his life. His eyelids fluttered shut, his lips trembling, his entire body gripping the glass like it was life itself. Mama Zawadi watched. Her hardened, weary eyes that had grown used to suspicion and mockery saw something she had not seen in decades. Gratitude unclouded, pure, uncalculated thanks. The boy didn't drink like a thief who had stolen, nor like one who expected more. He drank like someone saved. When the last drop was gone, Quito carefully wiped his mouth with the frayed sleeve of his shirt. His voice came quiet but firm. "I want to pay. Let me clean your house." He braced for refusal, perhaps punishment. The old woman raised her staff, but there was no anger in her motion. Her voice, worn but gentle, answered instead, "You've already paid, boy. You paid with your eyes, those eyes full of gratitude." The words struck Quito like a blessing. All the rejections, all the denials he had carried were erased in that moment. For the first time in a long time, someone saw him not as a beggar or nuisance, but as human. Across the street, the crowd of whispering villagers blinked in disbelief. Murmurs swarmed like startled bees. She gave him milk. Impossible. Mama Zawadi, who never bends, poured her cup for a stray boy. Astonishment spread faster than wildfire. Quito, broom in hand, staggered slowly toward the gate. But before leaving, he glanced back. His eyes shone wet, his promise unspoken, yet eternal. "I'll never forget." And he left, carrying not only milk in his belly but a new song in his heart, proof that one glass, one kindness, could change the shape of a life. Mama Zawadi stood at her doorway, following his steps with her eyes until he vanished down the dusty lane. And though her lips said nothing, her heart felt the crack in its hard armor. The glass of milk had not only saved a starving child, it had softened a soul long hardened by time. A moment so small, yet fate had already decided. This act would string an invisible thread, binding the orphan boy and the old woman together for years to come. By morning, the village's gossip wheel turned furiously. The milk, the boy, the witch. Now story and scandal. At the well, women whispered while pounding their laundry. Even a witch has to soften when faced with a child's hunger. Another spat into the water, shaking her head. Don't trust her. She has motives. A heart like hers doesn't bend so easily. At the market, men laughed loudly over their beer. Her milk never fed her own child, only stray broom boys, they mocked, words cutting sharper for being public. No one believed her capable of compassion. Suspicion smothered everything. But Mama Zawadi neither protested nor explained. She shut her wooden door, leaned on her staff, and sat watching the world from her straw chair. Outwardly, she was silent as always. Yet inside something restless had awakened. For the first time in years, she felt her solitude keenly, the sting of cruel gossip pressing heavier than before. And still, she held tightly to one memory, the boy's eyes shining as he drank. And that memory was shield enough. Keto, meanwhile, returned to life's rhythm. He fetched firewood, carried water, earned crumbs, yet something in him had changed forever. The memory of that glass burned bright inside him. He carried it like a secret anthem, whispering to him in every weary step, "You were seen. You were worthy." Children of the village, quick to mimic their parents' meanness, now teased him. "The broom boy sips witch's milk," they sang, laughing at his shame. But Keto felt no shame. He felt only the memory of a woman who, even once, had not pushed him away. Weeks passed. Lanterns glowed in windows at night, and dust joined the wind in low songs. The tale did not die. Men muttered, women judged, curiosity and envy weaving together. Why, they asked, had only she stepped forward to feed the orphan when so many had turned aside? 2 neighbors whispered near her house one night. "Did you see the boy's face? It was like he had lived a lifetime in one glass." The other stiffened quickly with fear. "Hush, don't repeat that. They'll think you too are under her spell." And all the while, Mama Zawadi sat listening quietly behind her door. Their words cut sharp, yet she kept still. Years of habit had taught her that the village never forgave. But now, for the first time, the sting didn't hollow her completely, because she remembered those eyes, and she reminded herself, "They didn't see, but I did, and that is enough." The voices in the square grew, then spread across markets, wells, homes. The glass of milk became a local legend. Some told it with sneers, some twisted it into mockery, others whispered it with secret admiration. The tongues of the village turned it every which way, but deep within, only 2 people knew its real meaning. In her chest, Mama Zawadi still felt the memory of the frail boy with his broom raised like a banner. In his heart, Keto carried forever the glass of milk that felt heavier, richer, prouder than a king's banquet. The people laughed, doubted, and whispered, but they did not know that in that moment an invisible promise had been born, a bond that sooner or later would change the life of the entire village. That afternoon, when the glass of milk saved him from hunger, Keto walked down the dusty road with short steps, still feeling the strength of the food within him, but more than a satisfied body. It was his heart that beat with a new energy. The boy, accustomed to hearing doors slammed in his face and insults from those who treated him as dead weight, had found in Mama Zawadi a gesture that changed everything. It was not just milk, it was dignity, it was life. Before disappearing around the bend in the road, Keto stopped. He looked back and saw the old woman standing at the door, her staff in hand, motionless like an ancient tree that withstands all seasons. Her gaze seemed to follow his every step, but without calling, without asking, without saying a word. At that moment, the boy, with a firm voice, despite his frail body, said, "One day I'll come back to give you more than I received." The words came out heavy with truth, not like an empty promise, but like a vow born from deep within. He himself did not know how he could ever fulfill it. He had no home, no family, nothing. But he felt how that woman a piece of his destiny. The sentence crossed the street and reached the ears of neighbors peeking from behind their windows. The reaction was immediate. Laughter, irony, poisonous remarks. "A hungry child's word doesn't fill a pot," said a man on his porch. "That boy speaks as if he has a future." "His fate is to die of hunger," muttered an old woman, not realizing the cruelty she poured into the air. The people laughed, mocked, because they did not believe anything of value could come from promises. Mama Zawadi, however, remained serious, her staff steady in her hand, her eyes brimming for the first time in years. She did not answer the laughter, did not silence the voices, echoing at the corners. She simply kept looking at the road. It was as if the boy's words had taken root within her, awakening a hope long smothered by the weight of solitude. The village gossip grew louder that week. The boy promised to return. "Imagine that," some said with sarcasm. "He can barely carry a broom. How could he ever give something back?" Others laughed. "If he returns, it will be to ask for more milk, not to repay anything." For the villagers, the promise of an orphan had no value. It was just wind bound to scatter with time. But for Cato, every word spoken that late afternoon was seared into his chest like iron on fire. He repeated it silently, while gathering firewood, while cleaning yards, while sleeping under sheds. "One day I'll come back to give you more than I received." And that phrase became fuel to endure pain and humiliation. Years passed. Cato's childhood was marked by daily struggle, but also by a stubborn will to learn. Whenever he found someone willing to teach him to read a word, to write a letter, or to tell a story, he clung to it as if holding on to a piece of bread. Many mocked. A street boy never becomes a doctor. But Cato kept silent the promise he had made before. Mama Zadi's house. For the old woman, life also carried on in its solitude. Yet there were nights when, sitting on her porch with her staff at her side, she would stare fixedly at the road. She never said it aloud, but inside she whispered, "Will that boy ever return?" Neighbors laughed at her distraction, saying she was losing her mind, but she did not care. It was as if she had planted a seed, and even without watering it, still hoped it would one day bloom. Time seemed to mock the promise. Nothing changed in the village. Nothing appeared to move toward its fulfillment, but life, invisible to the village's eyes, was already weaving its threads. The boy grew, the old woman aged, and the road remained the silent link between them. In both their memories, that glass of milk never faded. For him, it was the reminder that a single act of kindness could save a life. For her, it was proof that gratitude still existed in the world. Even when everyone judged her as cold, the people laughed, mocked, and forgot. But between the boy and the old woman, there was something no one could see. A promise made at the edge of the road, sustained not by wealth, but by the faith that life collects and returns everything in its time. And so with the road as witness, was born the invisible thread that would sustain their reunion many years later, when destiny would finally prove that promises spoken from the soul are never lost to the wind. Time, which is never in a hurry but never fails, moved over the village like the seasons that return without asking permission. The years turned Mama Zavad's hair from gray to white, and her body, once steady, despite her age, began to yield under the weight of solitude. She still lived in the same mud house with the same silent walls and the same straw chair where she spent hours gazing at the road. The boy's promise made so many years before still echoed in her memory like a distant song. One morning, before the sun had fully broken through the mist, the old woman awoke with a sharp pain in her chest. She tried to stand, but her legs gave way. The staff, always her support, slipped from her hand and fell to the floor with a dull thud. From that day on, illness began to visit her, first as a nuisance, then as a constant presence until it became a prison within her own body. The neighbors noticed her absence in the yard, but they did not worry. She must be too tired to come out, some said. Or maybe her time has finally come, others whispered, their contempt barely hidden, to the village. Mama Zavade's old age was caused for indifference. Few remembered the glass of milk she had given the boy, and even those who did treated it as a story of no importance. As the days passed, the old woman became confined to her makeshift bed. Her eyes, once hard, now brimmed with tears, not only from physical pain, but from the weight of knowing she would die alone. She had no children, no siblings, no one to hold her hand. All she had left was the memory of Keto's gaze that distant afternoon when he drank the milk as if it were life's greatest gift. The village whispers grew louder. She die alone. No one will miss her, they said in hushed tones as if death were a public spectacle. Some women passing by the door looked at the closed house and sighed. It's the fate of the hard-hearted to die in the same silence, they swed. The men in the marketplace remarked, "No one will care for her. She brought this on herself." But what no one knew was that behind those walls there was a silent battle. Mama Zawadi spoke to God in whispers. She did not ask for life, but for a little peace. "If my time has come, let it not be too painful," she murmured. At times she remembered the boy and silently asked, "Is he still alive? Will he ever remember the promise?" The nights grew long. The wind slipping through the cracks in the window seemed to carry voices from the past, memories of when she still believed in something beyond isolation. The cold crept into her bones, and loneliness weighed more heavily than the illness. The straw bed creaked beneath her frail body, and each breath felt like an effort wrestled from her chest. One day, a neighbor, more curious than compassionate, knocked at the door to peek inside. Seeing the old woman collapsed in bed, she rushed back to spread the news. Mama Zawadi is bedridden, too weak to rise. The village reacted with disdain. So what? Let her die in peace. Few showed any compassion. Many merely confirmed their expectations. To them, the old woman's solitude was the natural result of a distant life. Even so, there was a resistance in her heart. Despite the pain, despite the abandonment, she clung to a thin thread of hope. It was as if her soul still awaited something before the end. In the silent dawns, when her body burned with fever, she would recall the road and the frail boy clutching his broom. That thought brought her some comfort. The idea that one day he might return, even if only as a memory. But the illness gave no respite. Her bones ached. Her breathing grew short, and the days dragged on like eternity. The people's words echoed like a sentence. She'll die alone. No one will miss her. Yet destiny, quiet and stubborn, was already preparing another story. And when least expected, the road that had always carried people away would bring back someone who would change everything. Mornings in the village always seemed the same, marked by the sound of roosters, the smell of burning firewood, and the chatter drifting between the mutuses. But that week something different happened. A stranger arrived. He was a young man dressed in clean but simple clothes, carrying a well-sealed leather bag. He walked with firm steps, his gaze attentive, and yet his face bore an expression of compassion rarely seen. The curious quickly gathered. Who could he be? They asked one another. He doesn't look like he's from here. But he doesn't look rich either, others guessed. The news spread fast. A doctor had come to the village, traveling from afar, tending to the sick in forgotten communities. The people watched from a distance. Wary, many came closer, only to look, too hesitant to ask for help. But the young man did not seem intimidated by their stares. He kept quietly asking about the village until someone mentioned almost carelessly, "If you're looking for a patient, go to Mama Zavad's house. She's been bedridden for days. She'd die alone." Those words were enough to send the young man down the path to the old woman's home. Dust rose beneath his feet as he approached the faded wooden door. The gate creaked with the wind, and the house exuded that heavy silence of a place harboring someone at death's edge. He knocked, but no one answered. He pushed the door gently and stepped inside. The scene before him was painful. Mama Zawadi lay on her straw bed, struggling to breathe. Her eyes were half closed and her skin carried the pale tone of weakness. He came closer and called softly, respectfully, "Mama Zawadi, do you remember me?" The old woman slowly opened her eyes as if the sound of that voice had traveled from another time. She stared at the young man's face, trying to recognize him. For a moment, nothing made sense. But then his features awakened an old memory. The shining eyes, the expression of gratitude, the boy clutching a broom, asking only for a glass of milk. With tears forming, the doctor said, "It's me, Mama. I'm Keto, the boy who once asked for milk at your door." Silence filled the room. The old woman's eyes overflowed, and she tried to lift her hand but lacked the strength. She only wept quietly, as though seeing before her not just a person, but the fulfillment of a promise. Outside, a few neighbors who had followed the doctor out of curiosity crowded to peek through the window. When they saw the young man bent beside the old woman's bed, they whispered to one another, "It can't be. Is that the same boy?" The same one she fed, the news spread quickly. The frail orphan who had once begged for milk had returned as a doctor. Mama Zawadi closed her eyes and let the tears run down her time-worn face. She could not speak, but in her chest something rekindled. The road she had stared at so often had at last kept its promise. It had brought back the boy everyone said would never have a future. Keto held her wrinkled hand and said with firmness and tenderness, "You don't need to be afraid. Now it's my turn to take care of you." And there, before the disbelieving eyes of the village, the promise that once seemed impossible was fulfilled. The hungry boy who had asked only for a glass of milk had returned as a man, able to give back not just care, but also dignity to the woman everyone had called Bitter Dot. In that moment, the heavy silence of the house was broken by something greater than illness, the presence of reunion, the breath of a destiny no one in the village could have foreseen. That very night, after revealing himself to the lonely old woman, Kato did not leave Mama Zavadai's house. While the neighbors whispered outside, inventing 1,000 reasons to justify the orphan boy's return, he had already taken the place of the son she had never had. He set his leather bag on the table and began preparing simpler remedies. He mixed herbs he had brought from the road, set water to boil, and carefully cleaned the room that read off illness and neglect. Every gesture was slow yet filled with tenderness. Mama Zawadi, lying in bed, watched insolence. Her tearful eyes followed the young man's movements, as if she could not believe what she saw. For so many years she had grown used to silence, to enduring the people's indifference, to hiding her solitude. Now, suddenly, there was someone rekindling the fire on the stove, opening windows to let the light in, moving about as if that house could live again. The days that followed were marked by a quiet transformation. Keto rose early, tended to the old woman's wounds, brewed teas, massaged her weakened legs, and then sat to talk with her. At night, When the wind blew strong and the solitude seemed heavier, he stayed by her bedside, listening to her stories, broken by fragile breaths. Mama Zawadi whispered things she had never told anyone about the children she never bore, the friends who abandoned her, the mistakes she may have made by closing herself to the world. And whenever her voice faltered, Keto answered with the patience of someone who knew the pain of rejection. "You are not alone," he would say, holding her hand. "I still remember the milk that saved me," that the old woman wept softly, and in one of her murmurs confessed, "I gave a glass of milk and received a life in return." Outside the village watched with a mix of astonishment and indifference. Many pretended to see nothing, carrying on with their routines as always. Others laughed, suspicious that young man didn't come here out of kindness. Nobody does so much for free. He must be eyeing the house, the land. But none of them offered to help. The truth was deep down, no one wanted to burden themselves with Mama Zadi's old age and illness. And it was in that collective emptiness that Keto made himself present. He became the voice that comforted her, the arm that supported her, the hope that rekindled the home condemned to silence. The open windows let the sun in again, brightening once darkened walls. The smell of medicine mixed with hot food, and even the old yard seemed to breathe once more. One afternoon, while the young doctor cleaned the veranda floor, a neighbor passed slowly, pretending not to look. She saw the old woman sitting in a straw chair wrapped in a colorful scarf, and noticed that for the first time in many years, there was a smile on her face, small, almost timid. But there, the woman hurried back to tell others, "I saw it." Mama Zawadi was smiling, and it was at his side. The news spread quickly, and soon the whole village was talking. Some didn't believe it, others mocked. But the truth was that the sight of that woman smiling began to disturb them. After all, for so long they had grown used to hating her, ignoring her, using her as an example of coldness. Now it was as if destiny itself was showing them they had been wrong. The nights, once filled only with fever and groans, became moments of sharing. Keto would light a lamp, sit at their bedside, and ask, "What would you like to tell me today?" And the old woman would speak between pauses and sighs of how she had learned to defend herself from the world, of how she closed her doors to avoid being hurt. Keto listened attentively, sometimes answering only, "I understand." There was no sermon, no judgment. It was pure care, the care no one else had ever offered. In time, Mama's health began to show signs of improvement. The fever broke, her strength returned little by little, and she was able to walk around the house again with her staff. Every step was watched by Keto's proud eyes, like someone seeing a mother reborn. And each of her steps was also a silent plea for forgiveness, not only to the boy who was now a man, but to herself, for believing she had been condemned to eternal solitude. In that home, forgotten by the village, a quiet miracle was taking place. It was not only the old woman's body being healed, but her soul. And with every act of Keto's care, each tea prepared, each word spoken by her bedside, it became clearer. Goodness never dies. It only waits for the right time to bloom. The buzz that had been running through the village since Keto's arrival soon turned into unbearable curiosity. For many years, Mama Zawadi had been seen as a harsh figure, almost a despised shadow. And now people didn't know how to deal with the transformation that seemed to be happening inside her home. The rumor that she had smiled again was repeated from mouth to mouth, always with astonishment and suspicion. After all, who would believe that this woman known for her coldness could allow herself to smile because of someone? The first to approach were the women who usually passed by carrying gourds of water. They pretended to stop to adjust the cloths on their heads, but their eyes fixed on the porch. There was Mama Zawadi wrapped in a blue scarf, her hands resting on her lap, and beside her the young doctor whom everyone now recognized as the former orphan. It was as if the scene belonged to another story, not to that village, scarred by judgment and distrust. One of the women couldn't hold her tongue. Who would have thought? She, who never helped anyone, now being cared for like a queen. Another added, "And look at that. She's smiling, smiling as if she's found peace." The comment echoed, and soon more people gathered to see with their own eyes. The men who used to mock the old woman's past also began to linger around. They stopped at the gate, leaned on their staffs, and murmured, "Strange, isn't it? A boy returning as a doctor to care for someone nobody could stand." Others added in a tone reluctant to admit surprise, "The good no one noticed is coming back multiplied." Inside, Keto paid no attention to the looks. He was busy with his silent mission to restore to that woman the dignity that life in the village had stolen from her. He prepared her meals, cleaned the house, read to her in a low voice, and Mama Zawari, who once lived behind closed doors, now sat on the porch, unafraid of being seen. It was as though suddenly she no longer felt ashamed of her own existence. The neighbors' visits, however, were not out of true solidarity. Most came from curiosity, not compassion. Some knocked only to peek inside. Others invented excuses to pass nearby. A few even brought small gifts, not out of kindness, but to justify their presence. "I brought a little corn. Thought you might need it," one woman said. But her eyes scanned every corner of the house, as if seeking to confirm that something hidden was happening there. Mama Zawadi noticed it all, but did not react. Life had already taught her that the village's tongue would never fall silent. She only looked at Cato and smiled as if to say, "They can think what they want. I know the truth." One day, a larger group gathered in Thayard. They wanted to see with their own eyes the transformation of the lonely old woman. They were astonished to find not only a healthier woman, but also a house full of life. The fire burned in the stove. The smell of medicinal herbs filled the air. And on the old woman's face was something no one could explain. A glow, a lightness dot. It was then that one of the neighbors, once among her harshest critics, murmured with sincerity, "Who would have thought? The good no one saw is returning multiplied." The words echoed, and many lowered their eyes, ashamed, because deep down they knew they had never done anything for her. The old woman had survived alone, endured scorn, borne the venomous tongue of all, and now it was precisely that boy, once rejected and humiliated like her, who came to return care. The whispers did not cease, but their tone began to change. They were no longer only mockery or suspicion. There was also hidden admiration, though no one dared admit it aloud. The people were beginning to realize that life was teaching them a lesson they could not ignore forever. On the porch, Mama Zawadi closed her eyes for a moment and drew a deep breath. The light breeze brushed her face, and she thought to herself, "For years, I was judged by those who never knew my pain. Today they see me smile, and that is enough." Quito, seated by her side, kept the same respectful silence, aware that nothing needed defending. Destiny itself was already speaking for him, and each neighbor who passed, each curious glance, each ashamed whisper was living proof that the promise made years ago was being fulfilled before them all. It didn't take long for the village's curiosity to turn into judgment. The tongues had always found something to wound with. Soon began to cast accusations against Cato. It was as if the people couldn't bear the thought of kindness blooming in soil where 4 years they had believed there was only harshness and silence. The orphan's return as a doctor, his dedication to the lonely old woman, his constant presence in that house, all of it unsettled them. One day, gathered at the market, some men began to mutter, "That young man isn't foolish. Caring for an old woman like that's not kindness, it's interest." Another added, "He just wants the house and the land, waiting for her to die so he can inherit everything." The words spread like fire through dry grass. Women repeated them from their porches. "I've never seen a man care so much without expecting something in return. There must be something hidden here." The suspicions grew until a group of neighbors decided to confront him. They arrived at Mama Zavad's house in broad daylight, as the sun fell over the tin roofs and children played in the streets. The whole village seemed to gather, some out of curiosity, others out of malice. They clapped loudly at the gate and called, "Cato, come out here." He came out calmly, his hands still carrying the scent of the herbs he had been preparing for the old woman. He looked at the group of men and women gathered, and saw this was no call of friendship, but of accusation. One of them, bolder than the rest, spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "We know why you're here. Don't bother hiding behind your medis and smiles. You're only caring for that old woman because you want her house and land." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Others added, "Of course. Who in their right mind would do so much for free? He's waiting for the inheritance." The crowd stared at Cato as if expecting to see him ashamed, faltering. But the young man, steady, held their gaze. Then, with the same calm he had learned while facing hunger and rejection in his childhood, he answered, "My inheritance I already received. It was the milk that saved me from hunger." The words fell upon the people like a stone in a pond. Silence was immediate. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others stood frozen, unable to reply, for that phrase carried a truth impossible to deny. The gesture Mama Zawadi had made so many years before had saved a life, and now that boy had returned not to take, but to give back multiplied. Mama Zawari, who had heard everything from inside the house, wept in silence. Her tears were not only of emotion but also of relief. For the first time, someone defended her honor before the village. She who had endured accusations for so many years now had a living testimony standing before them all. An elder of the community who rarely spoke murmured in a hoarse voice, "He didn't come to seek inheritance. He already carries it within himself." Those words echoed, and little by little the whispers ceased. The crowd dispersed, each returning to their home with a weight in their heart. There was no denying it. Life's justice stood before them, showing that goodness, even despised, returns with strength. From that day on, the comments changed in tone. There were still some who remained suspicious, for malice never dies, completely, but many began to reflect in silence. And every time they saw Kito entering and leaving the house with a serene smile, carrying herbs, water, or simply a look of care, they understood they were witnessing something greater than self-interest. That afternoon, the public trial was not against Keto, nor against Mamazawa. It was against the village itself, which was forced to face its own cruelty reflected in the mirror of kindness. And so the boy who once asked only for a glass of milk showed everyone that true inheritance is not what you receive in possessions, but what you carry in the heart, and no malicious judgment can erase it. The days that followed the public judgment were different. The village, once accustomed to speaking ill of Mamazawadi, began to fall silent when passing by her house. There was no longer the same boldness to mock, nor the courage to accuse. Kito's firm words had left their mark on many hearts, and the silence that once surrounded the old woman now seemed filled with respect. Still, she knew forced respect is not forgiveness. The people still had much to learn. Meanwhile, her health, which had improved under the young doctor's care, began to waver again. It was no longer just the illness of the body, but the weariness of a soul that had lived too long in solitude and judgment. The wrinkles on her face deepened, and her hands, once steady on her staff, now trembled more often. Then one afternoon, as the hot wind blew dust over the village, she called Keto close and said, her voice low but resolute, "I want to gather the people. I have something to say before my days are over." Ko looked at her with concern. He didn't want to see her strain herself, but he also knew this was a decision of the soul, not just the body. He prepared the house, helped her dress in a clean cloth and a colorful scarf, and spread the invitation through the community. The news spread quickly. Mama Zawadi wants to speak to everyone. Many grew curious, others suspicious, but no one stayed away. After all, this woman had always lived in silence. What could she have to say now? On the appointed day, the small clay house seemed too large to contain so many people. Men, women, and children filled the yard, whispering among themselves. Some expected an apology, others a confession, still others a bitter farewell. But what they heard was something no one could have foreseen. With difficulty leaning on her staff, Mama Zawadi stepped out onto the porch. Her frail body seemed sustained by the invisible strength of her words. She looked at the gathered crowd and began to speak, her voice trembling at first, but gaining firmness as the sentences took shape. "I live my life in silence. Many of you judged me as harsh, bitter, incapable of love. Perhaps I did let myself grow hardened over time. But I want you all to understand, when kindness exists, it must not be forgotten like dust carried off by the wind." The people stirred uneasily, unsure whether to look at her or the ground. Some bowed their heads, remembering the times they mocked her loneliness. Others held her gaze, challenged by that voice that sounded like a reckoning. Then she asked Kato to come closer. The young doctor stood by her side, and the old woman extended Asmal wooden box worn with time. Inside were colorful threads and old needles that had belonged to her mother. Simple objects, but carrying the memory of an entire life. "My life was silence," she said, placing the box in Kito's hands. "But let your life be stitching people together. Let each stitch be a bond, each patch unite stories. This is my final wish." The village fell into absolute silence. No one dared laugh. No one dared whisper. The old woman's gesture seemed to carry symbolic weight, as if in that moment she was stitching her own story into the boy's destiny. Kito received the box as one receives a crown. He pressed it to his chest, eyes brimming, and murmured only, "I promise to honor it." Mama Zawadi sighed deeply. For the first time, she felt no need to defend herself or justify her life. She looked at the people and added, "What I once gave was only a glass of milk, but what I received in return was much more. I received life. I received companionship. I received the chance to smile again. Learn from this. Do not let kindness be buried." The words lingered in the air like a prayer. The people, ashamed, began to disperse in silence. Some, on their way home, reflected on their own harshness. Others, more stubborn, refused to admit what they felt. But all carried within them the image of the old woman handing over her simple inheritance threads and needles as a symbol of a destiny stitched together by gratitude. That day, it was not only Mama Zawadi who left a final wish. It was the village itself that received the chance to reconsider its way of living. And even if many resisted, all knew they had witnessed something greater than mere words. The transformation of a life which, though scarred by solitude, found redemption in the unexpected generosity of a boy who never forgot. After the day Mama Zawadi handed Kito the box of threads and needles before the whole village, nothing was ever the same again. The people who for years had mocked, accused, and ignored began to draw near, first timidly, then more often. Some came only to watch from afar, but many could no longer bear the weight of their own cruelty. The old woman, once seen as bitter, had become a gathering point. The house where silence once reigned now held movement, voices, and at times even laughter. The neighbors, who once prided themselves on saying, "We don't need her," began to bring small offerings, a handful of corn, a piece of meat, a bunch of bananas. They were not grand gifts, but each gesture carried an unspoken request for forgiveness. And Mama Zawadi, who could have refused, accepted with a slight nod, like someone who understands that the human heart needs time to learn. Quito, meanwhile, never stopped working. Beyond caring for the old woman's health, he began tending to others in the village, children with fevers, weary women, men injured from fieldwork. Slowly, the news spread that there was now a doctor among them, and Mama Zawadi's house became a refuge. It was as if the gift of a single glass of milk had multiplied into countless others, now served to the entire community. But Quito did not want to stop there. He knew the village needed something greater, something that would remain as a reminder for future generations. With effort, he sought help from acquaintances in other villages and managed to gather simple materials. At the entrance of the community, he built a small health post. It was not large, but it was enough to receive those in need. On its door, he wrote with his own hand a phrase that would carry through time. "Here begins the miracle of a glass of milk." When the post was inaugurated, the entire village gathered. There were no long speeches, no grand celebration, only the presence of the people now united around something born of quiet kindness. Mama Zodi was brought there, leaning on Quito's arm, and when she saw the phrase painted on the door, she wept in silence. Her tears were not of pain, but of recognition. The promise had been fulfilled. "I knew you would return," she murmured, looking at him with a mother's pride. "The road never lies," and Quito replied, his voice trembling. "I promised to give more than I received. Today it is not I who fulfill this. It is life." From that day forward, the old woman was never alone again. People came to visit her, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Children ran to her porch, bringing fruit and listening to her stories. Women helped sweep her yard. Men offered to repair her house. It was as though the entire village, ashamed of its past, had decided to stitch together the ties it had once torn apart. Mama Zawadi, who for years had been a symbol of coldness, became a symbol of dignity. The people began to say, "She smiled at the end of her life, and her smile changed the fate of us all." And, indeed, it had, for there in that small forgotten village they had learned that it is not wealth that transforms the world, but simple gestures made without expecting anything in return. With time, the old woman's health could no longer withstand the weight of the years. When she passed, she did not pass alone. She was surrounded by neighbors, by children who called her grandmother, and above all by the boy who once had asked only for a glass of milk, and now held her hand like a true son. Her death was not marked by bitter silence, but by a peace no one had ever imagined she could find. Quito remained in the village. The health post grew, gained new walls, new beds, new hands willing to help. But on the door, the phrase remained the same. "Here begins the miracle of a glass of milk." It was as though everyone who passed through its doorway was reminded that destiny is not written with great fortunes, but with small acts of love. And so the boy's promise was fulfilled. He not only returned to give back the care he had received, but multiplied that gesture for the whole village. Kindness, which many believed dead, had become both root and fruit. In the end, it was not the milk that changed the story. It was gratitude. It was the memory of a gaze. It was the faith that no promise made with the heart is ever lost to the wind. And the entire village learned that sometimes the salvation of many begins with something as simple as a glass of milk offered in silence. Time passed in the story of Mama Zawadi, and Quito ceased to be just the secret of the village and became a collective memory told in circles of conversation on nights of full moon as an example of what life can do when a simple gesture takes root. What once was reason for mockery was now remembered with respect. The people who once said she will die alone now said, "She taught us that no one is lost when kindness finds a home." Mazawari departed on a quiet morning, lying on her straw bed, her hand held by Quito's. There were no cries or desperate laments, but a deep silence, the kind that comes when the soul understands that its time has come. The whole village gathered for the funeral. The same people who in the past had called her bitter, cold, and useless were now there, mourning her passing, carrying simple flowers, leaving prayers around her body. The procession walked the dusty road, and for the first time, no one dared speak ill. The silence was one of respect. Quitito, beside the body, did not cry like an orphan losing his last hope, but like a son who had fulfilled his promise. His tears were of gratitude, not despair. He knew that life had taken charge of uniting them, of healing invisible wounds, and of showing the village that nothing is in vain. The people watching that scene learned something they would never forget. It wasn't wealth that changed destinies, nor land, nor golden inheritances. It was just a glass of milk, a gesture so small yet filled with humanity that it crossed years, broke prejudice, and stitched her lives together forever. After the funeral, Mama Zivadi's house remained standing like a symbol. Children ran through the yard. Neighbors tended to the place, and many said there was no death there, only seed. The village, once marked by cruel judgment, began to transform. More visits, more sharing, more care among one another. As if all in some way had learned that goodness only flourishes when multiplied. The health post built by Quito became the heart of the community. And at its entrance the phrase still read, "Here begins the miracle of a glass of milk." Many who passed stopped to reflect. Some remembered the frail boy barefoot, begging for food door to door. Others recalled the lonely old woman locked inside her house, judged by all. But everyone without exception understood that the place was more than a clinic. It was living proof that promises kept can transform stories. Time, which once seemed an enemy, was now an ally. The children born later heard the story told as a lesson. And when they asked, "Is it true that it all began with a glass of milk?" the elders would answer firmly, "Yes, it was a glass of milk. But what mattered was not the milk. It was the heart with which it was given." And so moral justice was fulfilled. The old woman, once rejected, died, surrounded by respect. The boy, once humiliated, returned as Aemon capable of saving lives. The village, once harsh and ungrateful, learned that kindness is never lost. It only waits for the right time to return as a blessing. Daudio. In the end, there were no winners or losers, but an undeniable truth. Life gives back at the right time. What is offered from the heart, and this story, which began with pain, hunger, and loneliness, ended with the certainty that even the simplest gesture, when made without calculation, can become the thread that stitches destinies together. Because as the village elders used to say, destiny may delay, but it never fails the just. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our